So this morning I wanted to take a closer look at suffering, the whole concept of suffering as the Buddha taught it, and as we has kind of evolved over the 2,600 years since he first taught. And my talk will be a little bit longer this morning than usual. We'll cut a little bit into our discussion just because it's a topic that requires a little bit deeper look. Um, but I need not tell you that reducing our suffering is a day-to-day challenge, and really the reason many of us come to this tradition, come to these teachings. And there are many ways that we can apply the Dharma in our day-to-day lives to reduce our suffering and the suffering around us. But I want to, as I said, take a little closer look at it, get into it in a little more depth this morning. So first thing I'm going to do is define it as the Buddha defined it, as he taught it. And then once I've done that, we'll talk about some of the more subtle, nuanced levels in which suffering occurs. It's really evolved over the millennia in terms of, especially in our modern times, in terms of how we think about it. So we'll get into some of that. And then finally, I'll say something about what do we do about it, which is really the whole reason we come together every week. As I pointed out in the past, the Buddha taught somewhat paradoxically that accepting our suffering is the path to liberating us from our suffering, that the key to reducing or managing our suffering is to accept it. And I'll have more to say about that in a few minutes. As you know, the Pali word for suffering is dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A. This is the first noble truth that the Buddha taught, the noble truth of suffering from the Pali Canon, and it goes like this, quote, now this, monks, is the noble truth of dukkha. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Association with the unbeloved is dukkha. Separation from the loved is dukkha. Not getting what is wanted is dukkha. Close quotes. So, in other words, whenever we are clinging or grasping, um, the source of our suffering shows up. And dukkha is generally and has been translated as suffering, but I think that's too narrow a translation. I think dukkha is more. It certainly involves suffering, but I think it's more subtle and nuanced than that because it can also include just sort of a generalized dissatisfaction and uneasiness, anxiety, daily annoyances, worry, all of these kinds of dukkha. So let me just give you a few examples of what I'm talking about here. Let's say we simply can't obtain or get what we crave or grasp for. Say I see the new iPhone and I really want it, but I can't afford it, or I don't, for other reasons, I can't get it. That craving is going to go unmet. That's a form of dukkha. We may get what we crave, but we don't get enough of it. This often comes up, when our adult kids visit and we don't get enough of them because they drop their suitcase and run off with their friends. So we crave more time with them, but they're off to their friends, so we don't get enough of what we want. Another example is we may get what we crave, but it falls short of our expectations. So we've been excited, we've gotten tickets to go to this concert, but then the performance is subpar. It's really not very good. So we're disappointed. Our expectations are not met. That can be a form of suffering and dukkha. We may get what we crave, but find that we are not as satisfied as we thought we would be. So we go to a restaurant for our favorite meal, but it's poorly prepared, and it's just kind of not great. That's kind of like the one just before, where it doesn't meet our expectations. We may get what we crave, but then we start worrying whether we'll get it again, whether it will always be available, whether someone might get it instead of us, or they might get the better share, and this might be something where we want to go to a presentation, but we don't get the seats that we want or the vantage point that we want because we're worried that it's not going to meet our expectations, our standards for what we expect and want. And then finally we may get what we crave, but yesterday it was fabulous, today it's okay. tomorrow it's just normal, and thereafter I'm kind of bored of it. It's just another toy, another car, another something shiny new object. So you can see how nuanced this whole notion of dukkha can be when we begin to sort of dig down on it. Now, in the Dukkha Sutta, the Buddha described three kinds of dukkha. And let's look at them because it really gives his nuanced view of the suffering as he taught it. So the first type that he taught is the suffering that arises in response to an unpleasant physical or mental experience, or sometimes referred to as unpleasant feelings or sensations. And of course, the circumstances of our lives will include unpleasant experiences. But these unpleasant experiences, this is very important, are not in themselves what the Buddha meant by this kind of suffering. Rather, it is our aversion to those experiences. It is our aversion to the unpleasantness that is the source of suffering. The unpleasant circumstances are going to happen. They happen daily, moment to moment, hour to hour, whatever, just little things, big things, whatever. That's not what he meant, but it is our aversion to them, our sense that we shouldn't have to have them, that causes the suffering. So this is the suffering that where the craving or longing is for the circumstances of our lives to be different. It is our aversion to the unpleasantness. And the way that we keep this kind of suffering from taking over is to change our response to the unpleasant experience. Acceptance. If we can acknowledge the unpleasant feelings, the unpleasant sensations, be with them, what I call holding it all, and let them run their course because they will be impermanent, then this type of suffering will not take over and continue to bother us. You know, knowing about impermanence makes it easier to stay with these unpleasant experiences because we know they will pass. Okay. Now, the second type of suffering that the Buddha described is similar, but it goes beyond simple aversion. Okay. This kind of suffering arises when there's an unpleasant physical or mental experience and we engage in stressful mental activity. This includes all that this shouldn't be happening. Why is this happening? The judgments, the anxiety, feel thoughts and questions. The second era. So we take the first situation of unpleasant experiences, and then we load all the second era stuff on. Oh, why is this happening to me? This is terrible. I don't know if I can stand it, and so forth and so on. This sometimes in the modern thinking gets referred to as existential suffering or constructed distress because it's the suffering that comes from just being alive, knowing nothing lasts, and then piling on all kinds of baggage about it. You know, why is this happening? It may manifest as an underlying unease about the future. And again, this type of suffering occurs because our mental activity reflects a craving for things to be how we want them to be, not as they are. We talk about this all the time. We're not seeing clearly how things are. We're seeing and wishing that they be otherwise. So that's the second category that the Buddha described in this particular sutta. The third category arises in response to pleasant experiences and is tied to the impermanence or change or the fact that they won't last. Okay. This is the result of enjoying something pleasant and craving for it to continue. Rather than being in the moment, enjoying it, we get caught up in knowing that it's going to end and sort of lamenting that. And often we'll go to extremes to keep it going. You know, we're enjoying this piece of cake, so I'll go ahead and have another piece of cake, or I'm enjoying, whatever I'm doing, and I keep doing it, to my detriment. And it arises inevitably due to the universal law of impermanence that always leaves craving unsatisfied. And it often occurs during a pleasant experience. Okay, there can be an underlying unease or dissatisfaction when we're happy or joyful because at a gut level we know it's not going to last. Okay? The Buddha taught that nothing that is impermanent can be fully satisfactory, and we need to accept that reality. He taught that normal experience is always negated by the transience of all worldly phenomena. This is a big one. Our experience of that transience can only be handled, our suffering can only be reduced there if we come to terms with this fact. Because if we want permanence for ourselves, for our loved ones, we're going to suffer because we're not going to get it. Not going to get it. This is a big one for most of us. So those are the Buddha's sort of three categories that he talks about in that particular sutta. So let's talk a little bit about how we manage these challenges in our lives, because this is a daily practice that can give freedom and a sense of liberation from these predictable forms of suffering. First and foremost, as you'll often hear me say, we have to become aware when suffering is present. We have to notice it when it arises. Very often we just kind of blow by it, or we don't tune into it. We feel, but we don't really pay attention or know why, or we're upset, but we don't really notice it in terms of, where it's coming from and why it's arising right now. This requires mindfulness and discernment, because all three of those types of suffering that the Buddha um, uh, talked about in that sutta can be subtle, they can be nuanced, they can be hard to recognize, they sneak up on us. We might feel that things are a little off kilter. We might feel a little dissatisfied. That's the cue to stop and say, suffering is happening. Suffering is happening. Then we can track backwards until we find either where we're not getting what we want or we're getting what we don't want. Once we begin to really look into this with mindfulness, these things become pretty clear. But we have to bring our mindful awareness to that sense of dissatisfaction, to being upset, to being off kilter. And then once we've done that, then the challenge is to let go of the craving, to accept the circumstances of my life as they are in that moment, not as I want them to be. Whenever I can catch myself and look at this, invariably, it's because there's either something happening that I don't want to have happen, over which I have no control, or something pleasant is going to soon be over with, and I'm grasping, trying to hold on to it. I'm having a really good conversation with somebody and they've got to go. And I say, no, just stay 5 more minutes. Let's just talk for a few more minutes. I'm really enjoying this connection. So, when we become aware in the midst of a joyful experience, for instance, that I'm feeling off kilter, there's a bit of unease or dissatisfaction, then I can go look at where is the origin of that dissatisfaction. And there it is. Okay. That whatever I'm craving is not going to happen. And if I'm going to see clearly, I'm going to accept that it's not going to happen. And guess what? My suffering goes down, my dissatisfaction goes down. I feel a freedom with that. I feel liberated from that suffering. Because when we accept impermanence, we can make a conscious choice to let go of the craving that whatever that phenomenon is not going to last, or that whatever that phenomenon is other than I wish it were. And then I can be fully present without the added baggage. Okay. Because often we're so busy worrying about, a pleasant thing ending or an unpleasant thing continuing to occur, that we just suffer. We just suffer. Because getting to the root of suffering, this constant nagging dissatisfaction in our lives, getting to the root of it is the key to being able to let go of it. And when we do that, even if we succeed for just a moment, we can taste that freedom, and it's a taste that lingers, and it's a taste that motivates us to continue to look at this stuff. It's a welcome respite from being mindlessly driven to try to control that which we can't control. And this freedom has a spacious, open quality to it. Dolores talked, I think last time, she's not here today, or the time before, about that spaciousness when she can let it go. It is a moment of cessation, which is a word you'll often hear in Dharma circles. The moment of cessation, which is the promise the Buddha gave us in the third noble truth, that through the abandonment of craving, the cessation of suffering is possible. the third noble truth, with the abandonment of craving, either to have things be other than they are or to hold on to them if they feel good, cessation of suffering is possible. The Eightfold Path, and I'm going to talk about that on Saturday. Wes had asked me to sort of revisit that, and we'll go through each of the steps of the Eightfold Path on Saturday, which is the fourth of the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha taught. It's his treatment plan, if you will, for understanding and managing craving and suffering. Um, it is the cure for the disease of suffering. It's the path that offers us the possibility of fulfilling our potential, of finding freedom, of finding reduced suffering through the cultivation of wisdom, ethical intentions, and mindfulness, all the tools that we talk about. That is how we confront our suffering head on. We don't run from it. We deal with it in the moment, and we experience the freedom that it brings. So let me stop there and get your thoughts.